Conveyor belt 3D printers are incredible. You can watch them make part after part without interruption, no need to clean a build tray, or you can watch them print infinitely long parts like swords, and it really feels like magic. However, I've met a handful of people online that seem disappointed with conveyor belt 3D printers that they've purchased in the past, and when I really dig in, it always seems to come down to one idea. There are some things that conveyor belt 3D printers are really good at, and there are other things that they're not so good at. And it really comes down to what type of parts do you want to make? What will make better sense for you, a conveyor belt 3D printer or a more traditional printer? I'm going to break all of that down. My name is Adam from PowerBelt 3D. Let's get started. Whether you want to build a treehouse, a submarine, or paint some tabletop miniatures, chances are you have heard the idea expressed before that you want to choose the best tool for the job. And when it comes to 3D printing and belt printers versus more traditional ones, this idea absolutely rings true. The biggest reason behind this is because with conveyor belt 3D printers, they typically print at an angle versus a traditional 3D printer has the X, Y, and Z axes all 90 degrees to one another. Because of this, things change. Parts look a little different, parts perform a little differently, which totally makes sense. The first difference has to do with overhangs. On a normal 3D printer, we have a concept called overhangs. An overhang can print an angle up to 45 degrees in mid-air without any issues, at least most of the time. But when you print at an angle, that acceptable overhang area rotates according to the angle you're printing at. What this means is all the features of your model at the front of the printer become an overhang. Every feature towards the back of the printer is self-supported and can be printed in mid-air. Our next main challenge has to do with the strength of parts. If you didn't know this already, FDM 3D printed parts aren't uniformly strong in all directions, being X, Y, and Z. It's really similar to kind of a wood grain where they're stronger in some directions than they are in others. They're stronger on continuous layers, but weaker along the z-axis when layers are stacked together. So if you print a thin part flat on the bed, it can be pretty strong. But if you print it vertically, it will be weak. So when you're trying to find the best orientation of a part, this is something that you have to keep in mind. Printing at an angle changes this part orientation idea too, especially for thin parts. Thin features that would lay flat on a normal printer and print in one layer become spread out over many layers. This changes their strength. So, even if parts are dimensionally nearly identical between a conveyor belt 3D printer and a traditional 3D printer, how they perform is different. Now let's look at what types of parts conveyor belt 3D printers are really good at, and then we'll talk about the ones that they aren't so good at. Belt printers are great at making long parts. Because we print at an angle, like I mentioned earlier, you can make parts that are infinitely long. If you want to 3D print swords or axes or, I don't know, crown molding, a belt printer is a great option. Several years ago, when I first started using belt printers, I didn't think this feature would be that big of a deal. I was way more interested in the automation side of things. But then as I did more and more printing, time after time I kept finding a part that was just like a little too big for a standard printer bed. Maybe I needed it to be like 250 millimeters long instead of like 200 or 220. And over, a belt printer just handled them really well. Belt printers are also really good at mechanical parts. If you're trying to make things like electronic enclosures or structural pieces that are kind of blockier in nature, belt printers tend to handle those really well. Now let's talk about some things that belt printers are not so good at. And this first one that I have to mention is such a good example. It comes up all the time when talking to people about belt printers, and that is vases. Vases are round, but more often than not, they have a steep overhang at the front of the printer that when you try to print it in its intended orientation, it just doesn't look very nice. If you want to print vases, chances are a traditional 3D printer is going to be a better fit. Similar to vases, I also see this issue with a lot of organic sculptures of heads or characters. A lot of times they're just kind of rounded on the bottom, and that creates a steep overhang that doesn't work well with this type of printer. Really thin parts are another type of design that tends not to work well with belt printers. The best example of this that I can think of is cookie cutters. If you go on Thingiverse or Printables or anywhere else, I'm sure you can find dozens and dozens of designs for 3D printable cookie cutters. On a traditional 3D printer, these work great because the thin part of the design that really holds everything together can be printed fast in just a couple layers and is still strong and flexible enough to be used as a functional cookie cutter. However, on a belt printer, these thin features get spread out over many, many layers instead of just one or two, and because of that, they tend to be more breakable. It's just not an ideal fit for the angled slicing that we have going on here. Round parts are my third example of parts that are more difficult on belt printers compared to traditional 3D printers. A great example of this is the rollers for the Ender Easy Belt. While the Ender Easy Belt project can make nearly every other part that you need for this machine, I would still prefer to 3D print the rollers on a traditional 3D printer whose X, Y, and Z axes are all 90 degrees to one another. When I look at round features on 3D prints, I think that when you compare a belt printer to a traditional 3D printer, the biggest difference is just its appearance. The angled parts just look a little bit strange, but I have a feeling that if we really took a 3D scanner or a CMM to examine things like roundness or concentricity, that the traditional 3D printer would do better. So I'm sure there's some applications where things like perfect roundness and concentricity don't really matter, and those could still be good on a belt printer. But in general, round parts tend to look a little bit odd and might be a little bit geometrically different compared to a traditional 3D printer. So if you need primarily round parts, traditional is probably the way to go. At the end of the day, I think the more tools that you have available to you to choose from to make whatever project you happen to be working on is a good thing. That way you can choose the best tool for the job depending on whatever you're making that day. If you found this video helpful or interesting or educational, it would be just really cool if you tap the like button before you get on with the rest of your day. Be kind to each other, and happy printing.